And I want to start by thanking the Canadian Embassy here for organizing this, and also the museum. I had a wonderful tour of the museum, which has some wonderful pieces from North America and the North American Arctic, and some from British Columbia, which made me a little homesick. I also want to thank you for coming today, and for your introduction and making some of my talk easier. As Alicia said, I actually have never been to the Nunavut part of the Canadian Arctic, so if you have questions on that, you should ask her and not me. And I apologize for not being able to speak in Spanish today. The head of the Arctic Council for the Swedish chairmanship recently said, "The Arctic is hot." And he wasn't actually talking about the temperature. He was talking about the incredibly increased interest in the Arctic. And as many of you know, the Swedish chairmanship of the Arctic Council is ending soon in the middle of May, and Canada will be taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. And the head will be Leona Aglukak, who's actually an Inuit woman, our current Minister of Health. And so we're very excited about the opportunity to once again lead the Arctic Council. And I think this is a very exciting time in terms of the Arctic as a whole, but especially in terms of of Canada's involvement. And as you said, the Arctic is a big part of both the Canadian geography and the Canadian identity. I also just wanted to say that when I talk about the Arctic today, I'm really talking about the Arctic and the subarctic, the circumpolar north, as it were. And as Alicia said, I'm more of an expert in the Siberian Arctic. I've been to a lot more of the Russian Arctic and subarctic than I have been to the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, which is maybe ironic. I thought I'd also just stick in a very short advertisement here. The organization that I'm president of is the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, and it's open to anyone who wants to belong. I would love to see more Spanish members, and so there's the website if you're interested. It's like I said, it's a member-driven organization. So I wanted to start with exactly what Alicia was talking about, which is this situation that climate change is critical to the Arctic. And this map here, I hope you can see it from the back. It shows the in a little orange line there, the extent of Arctic ice in 1979, and then the extent of Arctic ice this summer. And you can see there's been a vast decrease in the extent of Arctic ice. Change in the Arctic climate change in the Arctic will have a serious impact on Arctic environments and on people's lives. And it presents a lot of challenges, some of which Alicia mentioned, melting permafrost, potential greenhouse gases escaping from the permafrost, flooding, changes in the distribution of animals and plants, and that means invasive species, and these are just some of the changes. It also presents opportunities for the growth in mining and other resource extraction, for the growth in shipping, growth in tourism, things like that. What I want to argue today is that sometimes in looking at climate change in the Arctic, we also tend to forget that there are other changes going on that are also very important. And so what I call this talk is, it's about climate change, but also much more. Some Arctic residents will tell you, if you ask them, that climate change is a concern, but they've been dealing with climate change for millennia, and they're adaptable. They know how to deal with this. Others will say that the pace of change is a problem, and they haven't ever dealt with that before. But many indigenous Arctic residents will say that the rapid social and economic changes that are happening are what's really threatening to them. So I don't want anyone in this room to leave thinking that I'm saying that climate change isn't important. Climate change is very important. But my message is that we have to remember about the changes that are happening today that will affect life of the Arctic residents today, tomorrow, next week, in terms of economic, cultural, political, and social changes. And I also am, as the president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, I want to stress that a lot of these questions need to be answered by social scientists. And it's increasingly important that we include social sciences in the looking at the Arctic and dealing with these problems. Some of the changes that I think are important are under these different 5 categories: demographic change, economic change, political change, cultural change, and health and well-being. And I want to say a few words about each of these. I also want to say that this is a pretty short talk, and so I'm going to have to make some gross generalizations. The Arctic is a very diverse region. There are many contrasts socially, culturally, economically. And so I apologize for a lot of simplification, and maybe during the question period we can talk more about the diversity. So who are we talking about in the Arctic? There are about 4 million people who live in the Arctic. Now it totally obviously depends on where you draw the boundary of the Arctic. So this is Arctic and a little bit of the subarctic. And we often think of indigenous peoples. I've probably encouraged you to think about indigenous peoples by including this picture of some Avane woman in northeast Siberia. The indigenous population itself is very diverse. We have Inuit and Chukchi and Nenets and Avane and Athabascans, and there are about, there are well over 100 different peoples who live in the Arctic from the indigenous population, many, many different languages. But the indigenous population are only 8% of the Arctic population. And I think we sometimes forget that. The bulk of the Arctic population is not indigenous. Another thing we often forget is the Arctic is highly urbanized. 80% of the Arctic residents in Russia live in cities. And some of these are pretty big cities. 60% of Icelanders, who are part of the Arctic, live in the capital city of Reykjavik. So again, highly urbanized. And then, as Alicia alluded to, the rural population is very spread out, very sparse, living in very small and widely distributed villages. So these cause different issues for the urban and the rural population.